Today, as Dov mentioned, it's a hostile takeover of Consultants Corner. And we use this dedicated time to talk about grants. And this is going to be a little bit unusual that we're going to talk about both grants at the same time. What we know right now, what's changed. So just to go into this, both grants need pre-qualification. Pre-qualifications has changed. And CSI has a dedicated pre-qualification page. You can get it at CSI-NY.org/pre-qualify. By the way, this presentation is already up on the CSI-NY.org/security grants webpage. So both the past presentation and this presentation are both online already. So you can get it and review everything and get all of these links are live. Okay, so the NSGP is starting to come into focus. I asked the standard questions of who, what, when. Remember, for New Yorkers here, and I hope everyone here is a New Yorker, the NSGP is administered by DHS FEMA, but it's available through New York DHSES. And that's true in every state. There's a state agency that actually administers everything. Do not go and look at the federal guidelines when they come out. They really don't help you. They confuse you. You're a sub-applicant. You're not a sublight form of any sort, but a sub-applicant there. And, all the verbiage confuses you. The dates confuse you. You absolutely have to rely on the request for applications that New York State will put out. This year, the NSGP program was cut about 10%. And last year, just to put that into perspective, 242 New York nonprofits were awarded grants, and 36% of the people who applied were successful in New York State. It was 46% nationally. Don't have time to go into all the reasons for that, but those are the facts. And figure that we're going to lose maybe 4 grants this year, maybe more, maybe less. I don't know, but it's 242 was last year's number. Somewhere in the 230s this year probably. And everyone can apply for up to $150,000 in funding per site, up to 3 sites. They're going to release their NOFO at some point in the next 4 weeks. I would expect, using our hazy crystal ball, it will come out in the middle of Pesach sometime and be due. I can't say on Lag Bomer because Lag Bomer is a Sunday and they never have a due date on a weekend, but somewhere around there. So expect 4 or 5 weeks of working time on this, which means you better get busy because we're getting messages, that organizations have started already. They're in the middle of trying to get either their attorney general's clearance or their, SFS pre-qualification, and they're getting delays. It's taking weeks to get each element. What we advise you, if you're not already, you haven't done all of the preliminary steps, please, please, please get started now, or else you're going to be too late.
One point of clarification, especially for those of you who are a little newer to the grants, right? Like David mentioned, we're talking kind of about 2 grants today, right? There's the New York State Securing Communities Against Hate Crimes grant, which we're going to dive into the Q&A that the state released. But we're also finally getting information on the federal grant, the one we're more familiar with, right? All of us have known about for maybe 15 plus years now, the federal NSGP, also administered by the state. So there's a lot of similarities. And if you've done the legwork for the hate crimes grant, you'll have a lot of the pieces for the federal grant. So I just want to keep that clear. but it's on May 17th. A lot of you are familiar. That's the due date for the hate crimes grant, separate grant. And then we don't know exactly when. And that's what David's explaining, when the federal grant, administered by the state, but when the federal grant will open. So just we'll keep our ears posted. Obviously, make sure you get our emails and messages about the opening grants.
And again, if you go into the first edition of What's New that's on the website, there's 5 steps, between the two grants that you could be doing right now. Get all those out of the way so you don't have to worry about them. So here we're talking about a few changes in the NSGP. The investment justification will be very similar to last year. So you can just get a copy of last year's investment justification. I'll be saying IJ during the rest of the presentation. You can get a copy on the CSI-NY.org security grants website. And you can kind of start answering all those questions. They're virtually the same. FEMA just put out something they call the IJ checklist, which is basically saying whatever we've just said. But you can see their latest and greatest. The biggest change that we're going to see is scoring of the applications. In the past, applications have been reviewed by both state and federal reviewers. Essentially, this year, the feds are not going to do scoring. They're going to rely on the states to do their scoring. And, they're going to do something in terms of weighting, which we'll get into in a second. In other words, giving weights to different kinds of applications and different bonuses. But everything will be done in the states. Now, what does that mean, by the way? And, we'll say this again. New York State, we know they love the CSI assessments because CSI gives them a very, very complete picture of what's happening in a particular facility. And they always review what CSI assessments have said. Those never went to the feds. So the CSI assessment becomes more important, or your local police assessment if you're just getting a crime prevention survey. But they like the CSI assessments because it gives them more information so they can evaluate the importance of your facility. There'll be a few additions to the AEL, which is the authorized equipment list, which should have a closed parentheses. They're offering some tips similar to what we've said in a new publication, and here's the link. This is not new. New applicants, people who have never received NSGP awards before, get a bonus of 15 points. That will continue. There is also a bonus which started last year for disadvantaged communities. Most communities can qualify as disadvantaged communities. Most communities around New York. I saw Mamadou was on this webinar. I'm sorry, Mamadou, the Upper East Side is not one of them. So if you want to know if you're in or out, this is the link. It's worth an extra 10 points. And fortunately, in general, it affects us very little. Now, let's go to the state. Remember, on the feds, you get $150,000 each for each of 3 facilities that you have. So picking on Mamadou again, Mamadou has a primary school building, a middle school building, and a high school building to worry about. So he would be eligible to put in up to 100 applications for up to 150,000 for each of those facilities. And it's pretty easy to define a facility because they're very separate buildings with separate addresses. The state, you get a total of $200,000 and you can mix and match. So it can be one, for one building, you can mix and match physical security and cybersecurity requests. You can throw in for multiple facilities or multiple projects at the same facility. That's very clear. One thing that both grants really require is that, let's say that you made a request for video surveillance equipment, in other words, cameras in the past. You have to show them that, and their words are, builds upon or enhances the security measures previously taken. So there, I'll show you in a little bit where you do that in the state grant, but it should be, for example, you can replace aging and ineffective cameras. Is something that you can do. You can add 4 cameras to cover identified blind spots. Those are the kind of things that build on and enhance. And this is where you do that. And remember, if you're asking for cybersecurity, you need an additional narrative description, and CSI does do cybersecurity assessments. So go on to our website, CSI-NY.org, and go to services requests and request a cybersecurity assessment. That's something that you can do, and that satisfies the requirement. The eligibility for purchasing is essentially the same. Just note that public address systems, as far as we know, because we haven't seen the new authorized equipment list for the feds, but in the past, the state has specifically been very flexible on the type of PA system you have. So that's, the basic difference there and what's eligible. It's also, you should know that cybersecurity funding in the NSGP is limited to the systems that apply to your security equipment. In other words, if you have a server for your cameras and your access control systems, you can apply for it on the NSGP. If you have in the state system, if you have vulnerabilities in any of your cyber systems, you can apply.
What David's pointing out is some of the nuances between the grants. So it's important to recognize those differences if you're going for both or picking one or the other. But right, there's a lot of similarities, but at the same time, there's a few different requirements within each and what's allowed.
Now, non-permissible costs. The ones that are most frequently asked are the same for both. You can't fund a project that's previously been funded, except if you are building upon or enhancing it. Anticipating security costs for facilities not yet built or not yet occupied. And finally, personnel costs in the state, but the NSGP, again, to distinguish between the two grants, allows for security guard contractors up to 100%. Now, in the state, Dov and I had a discussion about this yesterday. In the state questions and answers, they were as clear as mud. They have a list of things, and here's the list. They answered the same for all of the questions about, can we have generators, license plate readers, facial recognition software? And they say, any items not specifically listed under the non-permissible costs are potentially allowable. And we'll tell you after the grant whether it's allowable. And these are non-guaranteed items. I can tell you that specifically the federal grant last year included generators specifically. As long as the generators were there to keep your security systems running. So make sure when you justify this, that federal grant, you have specified that the generators to keep existing security systems operational. The rest of this list, I would say, are obvious to me. If you have any specific questions, just Submit them into CSI_questions at CSINY.org. I don't think they're going to do speed bumps,
Right.
although you could argue if you don't have bollards or put in bollards and you want to add speed bumps to lower the potential for a ramming, maybe, but it's a stretch. There's one for handicapped accessible ramps. You
Probably
can
not.
make an argument that that facilitates evacuations, but it's a stretch. But you might get it if you're a facility for handicapped individuals. They're not going to say no over any of these because they're all potentially eligible, but you'll probably have to rejigger and spend your money on something else.
Let's reiterate that when the state provides guidance saying we'll know afterwards, it doesn't mean you shouldn't request it if it's a legitimate security purchase, right? David went through something which probably won't fly. But if it's a legitimate security purpose, submit for it. Last year, it happened that many locations submitted for some sort of upgrade or hardware, and that what happened was the state came back to them and just asked them to adjust their budget, adjust their project. So it's not that your request will deny your receiving the award. It's just that you'll have to change it later. So if you think that's something you really need based on a vulnerability assessment or the like, try for it. It should not impact your award. You'll just have to change your funding, change what you want to do with your project.
And, just Raphael's always asking about the prefabricated security booths, and they were not helpful. He's going to have to decide whether he's going to take a chance or not. Assessments. As I said before, good assessments will be more important than ever. Just make sure you have as good an assessment as possible. You can use a vulnerability assessment tool that's included in the state RFA. Doesn't necessarily give you what, top assessments from outsiders do. This is a sample of the first page of the self-assessment.
But to build further on our comments about what you can purchase and what you can't, you definitely, if it doesn't line up with whether it's an external assessment or a self-assessment, you likely will get denied. So for a simple example, you wanted to install a video surveillance system and you didn't mention you needed cameras. Obviously, the dots aren't going to connect and you probably won't be. So ensure that's a critical piece more than if it's specifically allowable in the grant.
You need good assessments. Here's some help on where to find good assessments of different kinds. You have to note that CSI is virtually at capacity. It depends where you are. We've been telling people to get an assessment for months. If you have an assessment, fine. But essentially, there's a way to upgrade an old assessment. Assessments are good for 3 years. CSI will do a new one every 3 years. And if you want to upgrade and refresh your, 2-year-old assessment, there are instructions on how to do that on the website. Okay. Now, in terms of the state grant, submitting your proposal, you need both their GMS system and Word. And I just keep reiterating it. You're going to have to prepare responses to questions both in the GMS app, and you have to do a separate Microsoft Word document using Arial 11 point font and 1.5 line spacing. No one's ever told me if they use double spacing instead of 1.5 line spacing, was it thrown out? But remember that you need to do your work twice. We always recommend you do your MS Word document first and then cut and paste it into the GMS application. This is confusing, and what's very, very important to remember is that last year in New York State, everyone who jumped through all of the specified hoops like this one attaching their questions and putting them into GMS. If you do both the Word document and GMS, you submit both. If you do all of those crazy hoops, then everyone got a grant who did that. They never went to the qualitative aspects of the question. I can't guarantee it this year, but there's going to be $60 million this year. So, that's good news. Here, questions 1 through 4, this is a change. Provide a narrative to describe the nonprofit organization. You must include at a minimum, and then it says size, number of people served, community served, primary use of facility, daytimes and operations, peak occupancy. If you're doing multiple facilities in question 3, you have to describe them here. So when you have primary use of facility, you say 123 Main Street is our preschool building. This is one of the places you have to upgrade it if you're doing multiple sites. Again, here's what I said. We'll assess facility every 3 years, and we will supply updated threat language, and you can just click on this and how to update your terrorism vulnerability assessment. And you go into services and you ask for the updated threat language, and your regional security director will be in touch with you. You can get a maximum of 40 points for this risk assessment. It's slightly altered. Don't worry about the number of points here. Just do everything. The budget, the budget is confusing, but everything you need to know is on page 31 of your request for proposal that you downloaded, and the budget detail worksheet narrative on page 40. It's all there. Just follow their directions and cut and paste. Again, in the budget for multiple locations, let's say you're doing fencing, and it's $45,000 for fencing, for 1 Main Street, 5 Elm Street, and 10 Fifth Avenue. And you kind of describe in the equipment justification where you're putting each installation of fencing. The bonus question 14, is where you explain that you're building on or enhancing the previously funded questions. And then there's an application checklist, which is on 25 of the proposal, of the request for proposals. You have to complete your SFS pre-qualification. No requirement to document that. They'll check.
Pre-qualification at this point, I think we've beaten to death. But we don't have all the answers. It's unfortunate that the system's transferred. Honestly, David has put everything we know. I honestly, your first step, even before posing us a question, is to go to the website, like David opened today's webinar, and follow our pre-qualification information. It's really all spelled out there, what you required. There was a lot of questions about the New York State being registered with the Charities Bureau, who needs to do it, how do you check? It's really all there. And it's important to recognize that pre-qual is your first step for both grants. Once you do that, it's a big out of the way. Your assessment's required. And then, because we're getting a couple questions, then there's 2 different systems to apply for these 2 different grants. The state grant, the New York State Hate Crimes Grant by DCJS, you apply through the grants management system. The federal grant administered by DHSES, you apply through the eGrants system. And the pre-qualification is done in SFS, and that's required for both grants. So just make sure you have all these documentation. Your first stop, hands down, should be David's website, our website, CSI-NY, that David is the brains behind, and we all pick at and make sure it's clear, and will really help you navigate the pre-qualification requirements.
You just click on the appropriate section, What I've tried to do there is to put screenshots in, that show you where to click because it's far from clear. And they use, just so you know, according to the SFS system in the state, you're a vendor. I don't know anyone here who considers themselves a vendor, but in this system, you just have to remember that they're talking about you if they're talking about vendors.
I would just advise, watch last week's segment where we talk about SFS a little bit deeper. I want to make sure that any changes that came out of the Q&A this week, we're going to start sharing with you.
Now, remember, we talked about a GMS system. I can't just give you a link. You have to register for it. And all of these links are hot. So you can click on this and find the grants management and registration requirements. You click on it, you fill in your name, your contact information, your email, and they'll check it off and they'll send you credentials. Then it says you have to complete all necessary contractual requirements as described in the section Administration of Contracts. Now, people have already asked, do I have to attach all of these? It doesn't say attach. It says complete, but I recommend that you attach all of these documents. You complete the encouraging use of New York State businesses and contract performance document, which says, yeah, we're going to try to use New York vendors. Those are real vendors. Those are the contractors who will install your cameras and your doors and things like that. You have to review the MWBE utilization proposal form. It says specifically no requirement to submit, but fair warning, MWBE is probably back.
Let's clarify, not probably. It is back.
It's back. The question is, what kind of flexibility DCGS actually has? They don't like it. By the way, for your federal grants, there is no MWBE requirements. There are no such requirements because it's federal money, not state money. That's the way it is. So it is back. You have to have a completed sexual harassment prevention training. You have to, send in a certificate that you watched a very boring 45-minute training. And then it wants all tier 1 and tier 2 evaluation requirements. These are check off the boxes kind of things that they are going to look if you've submitted all these. You've done all the questions in GMS and you attached the Word document. You completed the budget tab in GMS. You did the work plan. You attach a vulnerability assessment. If you are asking for cyber, you've attached a cyber security self-assessment or our self-assessment and a ground level photo of the front facade of your facility. Simple. Do it now, not today because it's raining. You don't have to go out in the rain, but when it gets decent again later in the week, take the picture now so you don't have to worry about it at the last minute and worrying, can I upload it into GMS? And now that was an express presentation, and we still have some time for questions, even given our hard stop.
Definitely. Thank you, David. Right. Look, hopefully you've been to some of our previous sessions to navigate and dance between the two grants like we started off today. There are similarities, but there are differences. We try to navigate that for you and be a resource. And it's unfortunate that even with the Q&A information that DCGS provided, we still don't have perfect clarity on some things. So with that and our experience from previous grants and what we have learned through working with grantees and organizations like yourselves, we can share even broader with everybody else as a CSI organization or client. So let's just go through the questions real quickly. Please feel free to add in. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but again, have to stop at 11. I know we kind of covered the wide breadth of the application, but to dive in, there was a question about a CSI webinar on IJ. In the previous, IJ is the investment justification that you're required to fill out to apply for the federal grant, the NSGP. We usually do another session when the NSGP is open. We don't know some of the changes. We assume that the federal grant will be similar rules, and we will probably do another session as that due date becomes closer. Let's focus today's questions on the hate crimes grant. It's now April, and the grant is due, your application is due May 17th. There was a question with a pretty straightforward answer. Are generators allowed under the NSGP? Yes, though they are an authorized equipment list category. The hate crimes grant, as you saw on the list David provided about midway through the slides, we didn't get a clear answer. If you believe it is a legitimate security need, present your case. Worst case that happens is they tell you to adjust your budget. A couple questions behind the scenes, David, I'll pose to you. For the new awardee bonus, so this is for the federal grant, for the NSGP. If I have two buildings and I got an award for one building, kind of get an extra 15 points, right? This year, 15 extra points for a new organization. So can I get extra 15 points for the second building because it's new?
The question on the IJ is, have you ever received an NSGP grant? And the answer would be yes. Anyone who's answered yes is probably not going to get a grant, but at the end of the IJ, there's a spot to explain. You can say this is for a new facility. I doubt it if you're going to get it, but tell them it doesn't hurt. You're telling the truth.
Right. But I agree with David. It's going to probably be organizational. And if your organization based on EIN will likely be determined you already received the grant, you probably will not receive the extra points. A side question I got, and I've gotten this via email many times, would a monitored surveillance service or some sort of offsite monthly type of service package be allowable for the hate crimes grant? And this was actually, I can turn that to David, but I can also read the verbatim answer from DCJS.
This is part of anything that's not deemed non-allowable is potentially allowable. So the point is, for any application as a service, this is called. So any offsite monitoring, any analytics, any, for your cameras, and I'm getting technical here, with the camera systems, and anything like that is potentially, I would argue strongly that it is, but explain, for example, on camera analytics, first of all, you don't have to break it down, but let's say you did. So camera analytics, you buy a camera, and then we tell you these grants are, the state grants are 2 years, the federal grants are 3 years. So it's something that you have to remember. So for 2 years for the state and for 3 years for in the federal application, calculate 2 or 3 years licenses for the analytics component of your camera system. What does that mean? That these cameras can tell you, you can program the cameras to tell you specifically if there are people outside your building or inside the building in areas where they shouldn't be at a given time. So if the sanctuary of your synagogue is not in use generally, except on Shabbos and Yom Tov, you want to know, does someone go into the sanctuary on the other days of the week? Your camera system can send you a notification. That's an analytic system that has, the answer is real-time notification of potential security events.
Right. There's definitely the security applications, and if you do plan to purchase something like this, whether it's an alarm monitoring service or something like David's talking about, make your case. But like David said, it wasn't clarified, unfortunately, in the answers. They said it would be determined on a case by case and evaluated by DCJS. But the most important thing, even more so whether they approve it, is it has to be in the contract period. So if DCJS grant, if the hate crimes grant we know is a 2-year period, and you get a 3-year service contract, obviously a year of it will be outside that window. All right, to move on, because the questions are starting to come in. Just to reiterate to everybody, CSINY.org is our website. Follow the links for security grant information. You will find our SFS guidance. You will find links to these webinars and Consultants Corner archives, and as well as this presentation. So just real quickly, let's reiterate for SFS, that's where the statewide financial system where you do your pre-qualification has to be done on their website. Our website has resources and guidance, and it is a little tough. David, do you want to speak for just really, really quickly on some of the tricks you've learned that people can use to navigate and to make their way through the pre-qualification system?
If you were registered as of December 15th, 2023, you received instructions on how to sign in. If you were not qualified on December 15th, 2023, then you have to register new in SSF. And, first of all, they have a help desk. And you have to download the grants management registration form, fill it out. And here are hints to fill in the form, what to put in every element of the form, how to get the authorization. They want a substitute W-9 form. Just follow the directions here. One of the problems, if you already have SFS, because you were pre-qualified in December, and this is really important. What has happened is the principal administrator of Grants Gateway. Sorry to start, I'm talking word salad, but the word salad is important. The principal administrator in Grants Gateway is automatically the delegated administrator in SFS, and that person can grant roles. What they recommend is that the delegated administrator can click on all the various roles so they can do anything they want. And a lot of this has nothing to do with anything, because SFS was basically built to help the state pay bills. And we're a kind of a little corner of it that they would rather not have. Delegated administrator, and then if there's a second, everyone has to be, including the delegated administrator, a pre-qualification processor in order to change your system.
I want to make sure everyone realizes this is really spelled out. How David builds this website is based on the questions and concerns we hear, including some of these questions I'm seeing in the chat.
And, just as an example, adding rules, what I just explained, here's a video on it. It's like 8 minutes on how to do it.
Don't shoot the messengers.
If it's not working, sign out, clear your cache, and start again. And here's their handbook. And they have a video on renewing a pre-qualification application. Because remember, and we have to remind you of this every year, even if you are a synagogue or a religious school, you have to renew at least your finances every year. You have to submit new finances. So that's what you have to do.
David, without going through everything, because we have a good amount of questions that people should refer back
Again,
to the
here
website.
we have screenshots. Just go here. This will answer all the questions.
The last thing I would say, advise everyone to do, the last box here, the last box is where David broke out all the questions that we really see, guidance on organizational information. Most questions that I see can literally be answered verbatim here. So I think before you ask, not that we mind, but it's right here, and we're going to refer you back to right here, right? We're not going to reinvent the wheel when we already just reinvented it. So I would please come to this website and check it out. We really try to build it up for you. But I do want to continue with the questions so we can finish in about 10 minutes. An important question, a very important question regarding MWBE. I'm going to answer some of these, and David, please interject as you see fit. So if we have a project and we used an MWBE contractor in the past, do we need to advertise and solicit new bids? The reality is, for any grant, you need to go through that procurement process again. So the short answer is yes. The little bit longer answer is technically there's the sole source provider waivers you can do. I wouldn't advise that. They're usually more difficult than just following the process. And then when you do your matrix, I don't know, if I was evaluating someone who already knew my site and our systems and can integrate seamlessly, they'll probably win a few more points than a new vendor. But yes, in short, unless you go for that waiver, which I would not advise, they're usually more of a headache, at least under dishes. You have to go through the whole procurement process every year for every project.
And one other point to bring up that we haven't done yet is that's a question to ask your program rep. We cannot answer these questions for them. Only they can answer the questions. And, you have a grant in hand, send them an email and say, look, we used this vendor in the past. Can we just use them without bidding? I'm not sure how they'll answer, but ask. It doesn't cost anything. Right. And they're not there. This is our, standard spiel for either grant. They're not there as a gotcha. They are there to really make sure you install the equipment, do what you said you have to do, and you get your reimbursements.
Reality is, we usually start off these sessions, and whenever you talk with us and do a one-on-one call or with the regional security directors, we cannot speak for the state. You can always ask them. We're trying to just fill in some of the gray areas to the best of our understanding, but definitely always feel free to reiterate that question. All right, real quickly, does the MWB apply for previous grants? Last year's, so sometimes what gets confusing is DCJS kind of joins fiscal years on their grants. It makes it a little more confusing. If you got the last award, they told everyone they were not required to do MWBE. It's this new RFA that's out, that's due May 17th, that when you are awarded, you will be required to do MWBE again. The 2019 hate crimes grant by Dishes definitely required it. Most of those are already closed out, but this coming year is where it's required again. So a little confusing, but just follow the guidance, and hopefully your rep at the state agencies are keeping you in line. So there's a question. So new facilities that are not open cannot apply to build security into facility. That is pretty much a black and white answer. If you're not even just not built, especially not built, but if you're not occupied, if you're not there, then it is not eligible for the grant. Obviously, for facilities like a camp where you're only open over the summer, is not what that's talking about. That's understood as occupied for their seasonal operations. But if you're a facility that is not open yet, or especially not been built,
wording is currently in use.
Exactly. I think today we're going to skip going too deep in MWBE. We've done previous sessions. If you look in our Consultants Corner archives about MWBE, when you get to the procurement process and need to find bidders, once you have your advertisement, you can share with our team and we will distribute. We can't refer vendors, but we will distribute. And if the network we know of includes some reliable MWBEs. There's some questions on the M&A, the Management Administration in the NSGP grant. I'm going to answer this because it's a pretty straightforward answer, but I want to focus on the hate crimes questions. Are there any limitations with the M&A allocation in the federal NSGP grant? I've heard that it can't be used to supplement funding or current personnel, only can be used for new hires. Is that true? That's 100% true, but I'll explain further. It cannot, the M&A, Management Administration, the little percentage you're allowed to use can only be used for additional, not even a new hire. It won't be enough to pay for a new hire, but if you bring in a consultant to specifically manage your paperwork, it doesn't include security consulting. It cannot be used to pay for hours to pay for current work. If an employee were to work extra hours that you're paying separately, that could qualify. In truth, the M&A comes out being less helpful than it sounds like, so I wouldn't overly rely on it to pay for current staffing because it cannot.
And in other words, if you have a current employee and you're showing on their paycheck that they're getting 3 hours overtime per week to do this grant, that's allowable, but check it before you do anything. Check it with your program rep and explain to them how it's happening.
Just to reiterate, the state grant, next question, the state grant does not pay for personnel, does not pay for guards. Only the federal NSGP, which is not opened yet, we assume later in April or
And it
possibly
does
May.
not pay for M&A.
And the hate crimes grant does not pay for management and administration, which we were just talking about. Yes, this year the state grant is reading the RFA or any of the documents is very clear. I don't want to reiterate it here too much. They're not separate $50,000 grants. It is one $200,000 grant that can be distributed amongst your facilities or many facilities on a campus. You just are required to have an assessment for every building. You are required, if you're on a campus and you want to use different buildings, they want you to point out the specific buildings in your assessment or self-assessment where you plan to do hardware. So that's important. It is a big change. Please refer to the RFA in the last Consultants Corner session. If I'm applying in one application for 2 sites, how should the answers be entered on the Word doc and in GMS? Okay, Fall, that's a good question. Literally, I don't think we can go into that here. The
It's
Q&A,
question
David,
3 and question 14.
right.
And you have to have the
Question,
exact same thing on question 3 and question 14.
what David's saying is in the Q&A document that DCJS submitted. Yeah, it's like 40 pages. But they literally, there's obviously a lot of the questions that everyone asked, and it literally spells it out. And I don't want to mix it up here about how you use one application to apply for 2 sites. It's answered pretty straightforward. I would advise, David, maybe we can put the link
And
in
the
the chat
budget
before
tab. The budget tab in GMS, you have to show the sites under equipment justification. And you do the same sort of chart that I showed in the slide.
Right. Right.
And just download it, just, going to the CSINY.org/security grants website. This is part 1 and this is part 2. This is the update. And you just click on either of them and you get what I just presented.
To continue in our next remaining few minutes. We don't spend all the money of our grant. Is that okay? Or will we get penalized? You will not get penalized. It's unfortunate when that happens, but new submissions are scored, whether the federal grant based on your IJ or a state grant based on your application, not previous years, except for the extra points, whether you got a grant or not.
But you should feel guilty because you're taking that money from someone else.
The FEMA NOFO, right? That's the notice of a funding opportunity, will hopefully be released in a few weeks. I wouldn't overall be too stressed on when the NOFO is released. It's more important when your state agency in New York State, the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, when they say they'll be releasing the grant. Again, likely because you can't do anything once the federal NOFO, everyone gets gobbled up in the NOFO. It's more applicable to the state. And when the state releases it based on their timelines is what's more applicable to us as organizations. Here's an internal CSI question. I signed up for an assessment, in this example, a cybersecurity assessment, but it says I'm required to sign an agreement and insurance certificate. Our team, so 2 points. One, our team is maxed out. We are redlining, but we're trying to do as much as we can. So it's possible we might not get to you in time for the grant application, and you might need to consider other sources to get your assessments or cyber assessments or do a self-assessment. The signed agreement will be sent to you by our team. Check your spam folder. It might come from an email address called at Zoho or similar, or from our administrative chief, Jamie Matos. She'll send you an example of your insurance certificate. You get that from your insurance provider. For today, I'm going to skip over NSGP questions. UEI is not required for the state grant. David, if you type in the link to the CSI website, we've mentioned it multiple times, CSI-NY.org. You'll see links to security grants updates. The reason we kind of skimmed some of the federal grant questions, because the fact is it hasn't been released. And the fact is, even with the federal release, there's state interpretation. So we don't have all the answers. We'll do another session as that comes closer. I know it gets a little confusing because we want everyone to get ahead of the curve. Because at this point, even our team from assessments perspective might not be able to help everyone. But David, I think for the last question for today, if you could just say that this year it looks like the federal grant will pay for how much of guards, officers.
You can ask for 100% of your grant to be guard money. There may or may not be waivers. The state has always submitted the waivers. You don't have to worry about it. And 100% requests will be considered without prejudice. You just have to justify it. You have to show it in your assessment that that's a gap.
I'm going to close out with two last comments. One, please feel free. I know we didn't get to every question, and there's more questions. Familiarize yourself with our website, CSI-NY.org, the DCJS request for application that has all your guidance, and as well as the Q&A document. But again, you can reach out to your regional security director or our CSI questions email. The one thing we'll point out, which was advised to me offline, thank you, is if your fiscal year is going to expire before the grant deadline, this is part of your pre-qualification requirements, you will make sure that you don't expire right at the deadline. So keep an eye on when any documents in your pre-qual, because this was a long grant period. It was several months long. Things can change, some documents can expire. Keep an eye on your pre-qualification, your SFS, that's the same.
The deadline last year was before the deadline this year. So it's almost, if you just pre-qualified by the deadline last year, for sure your documents will have expired.
With that, thank you, everybody. I know it's a lot of information. We kind of wanted to just fill in gaps today. Maybe we created some more, but definitely watch some previous sessions here. I can't reiterate enough. I really think that the website will navigate 90+% of your questions. So with that, thank you, David.
Just a reminder, CSINY.org/security grants. It's up on the screen right now. There's a lot of questions that we've tried to answer. We're going to be posting later in the week, even a deeper dive on the state grants. With that, I want to thank Dov, our consultant coordinator, and thank all of you for keeping your facility safe.